Andy, it's been a long time since we saw each other in person. But as ever, it certainly has, and it's not been the same to see you on screen, but it's equally brilliant just to connect with you as always. I know you've been incredibly busy with lots of exciting and wonderful things, and we'll talk about more about what you've been up to. But thank you firstly for giving up your time once again to give us some insight into mental health, the world of mental health, and how we can help to support ourselves and our colleagues and anybody that we might know. So really appreciate it. I'm going to do a little disclaimer at the beginning of this, just because I know lots of people will be tuning in, and lots of people will already know you, but for anybody that doesn't, Andy is an open book when it comes to sharing his own mental health experiences. We don't have any PC in the room during our conversations. So a bit of a health warning is probably a responsible thing to mention. We will be getting into the depths of talking about mental health and mental health issues. So please be aware of that. And there might be a few expletives that crop up here and there.
I'll try to behave.
We're going to try not to use any, but that might happen as well. So if you have sensitive ears, might also be a good idea to be aware that some naughty words might pop up, in honesty. Right, lovely. So we've just been talking about your video, which is about breaking the stigma. Tell us how you are, how you're feeling. Let's start with that. How are you right now?
Right now, I'm tired. It's been a busy year, 2 years, but there is more positivity in the world, but there is also still a lot wrong and so on. And where I am right now is just trying to kind of find my future again, after losing so much of it to the past couple of years and what's been going on in the kind of global climate and so on. So uncertainty is always tiring, but you accept your part in that and you just kind of make the most of it.
Yeah. I'm thinking about your video, Andy, and you've mentioned losing so much of the future over the last 18 months, 2 years, and losing sight of things like goals and visions, etc., because there was so much uncertainty, so much was changing day to day. So what has it been like to start to rebuild some of that? I know you've been working hard at trying to establish some kind of vision and a direction. So what is it? What's that looking like for you at the moment?
Yeah, so basically coming into the kind of ongoing global pandemic situation, I was in a position where I lost an awful lot. I lost kind of my income, I lost my business, I lost my home, and I ended up with very little. I had my friends, my family, and my cat Pika, and so on. And as I was kind of going through that, and as I was hearing the world struggling, as everyone dealt with the loneliness and isolation that comes with working from home, as mental health was suddenly brought to the forefront of the agenda, I wanted to help because I've kind of gone through a lot of this myself with my own experiences. And what I realized was I couldn't, and so on, like I couldn't volunteer as, say, a therapist or a counselor or anything because I didn't have the necessary background. And then it kind of twigged with me that every time I had done a presentation about my lived experience, I always caveated it. I always said, this is lived experience. I'm not a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, psychologist, psychopath, maybe not the last one. I'm not those things. But what if I was? And that was kind of my mentality going into the past year. But what if I was? Having lost everything and wanting to give more back to help people, I decided that I would do something to enable me to do that. So I qualified as a chartered psychologist. So I studied a psychology conversion master's, and I undertook research projects into things I cared about. So mental illness, stigma, and so on. And I still don't know where it's going. Like, I am now in this incredibly weird position where I'm one of only a handful of people in the whole of the UK who is a chartered accountant and chartered psychologist. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it does, but I understand that niche intersection very well. And I'm trying to help people with people in business and so on. And obviously my experience comes with mental health, mental illness, and mental health stigma, and so on. And it's just trying to piece all that together where the future is. So I'm exploring various options, like I'm interested in furthering the research and so on, maybe through undertaking a PhD. Equally, I'm looking at like working in or within businesses and so on, if there's opportunities to do that. And so if anyone is interested and listening, I would welcome a conversation. Please get in touch. I sound really positive about this. I'm terrified. And I would just welcome any conversation about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, that message is loud and clear there. We will put Andy's contact details in the links, that descriptions, etc., that come with this video. Wanting to help people is a clear intention that you've had for the 3 years that I've known you, and I know that started well before that as well. And you've got a real lived experience, we call it, but personal experiences that you have shared with global businesses far and wide. That's been really, those conversations have been incredibly well received. That honesty has been really well received. And so what I'm hearing is that loss that was experienced, you've kind of channeled that into a vision, and created something from it that is upskilling you, helping you to really affirm that intention of, I still want to help people. I've been helping people and I want to continue to do that with the lived experience that I've had, but also with academic understanding, with research, with really using understanding about what people are going through right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And ultimately with a qualification.
Yeah, that's kind of it. Like, I used to live in a kind of a world of shoulds and should nots. Should I do this as an accountant? Should I be seen doing this, etc. And slowly I've changed my life to be about coulds and cans. Can I do that? Can this be possible? And this was just another kind of could I do more? Like, I have long described my life as a bit of a pachinko machine where I kind of fall through and figure things out as I go and hopefully land on my feet. I don't know the future, but I'm just doing what I can, kind of one bit of work at a time and so on.
Brilliant. Well, in therapy, we sometimes say should and shouldn't are two of the most harmful words that we can use towards
they really are,
and to others. A lot of expectation in there and judgment sometimes as well. So completely love the what can I, what could I, what will I, and choosing to do things.
Yes, exactly.
And mindfully. All right, well, we did kind of set out some questions for this conversation, but as our conversations go, I don't imagine we'll stick to them too strictly.
No.
But research with Leeds Beckett University, fantastic university, really close to my heart, and I know that they've been brilliant supporting you to do this work. this research project. So tell us a little bit about that. What was the research about? Did the results say what you expected them to? Because you've had a lot of insight into law firms and accountancies and the mental health that exists in those sorts of professional service businesses.
Yeah, so I'm going to monologue for a bit because it's probably just easier to do that. So I had been talking about breaking the stigma because when I was struggling with my mental health as an accountant, I never felt I could talk about it. And there was this sort of stigma that I felt existed, that if I spoke about it, then my career would be over and so on. And like this was reaffirmed by lots of people. So what I wanted to do, like after giving my my presentation, breaking the stigma all over the world and stuff like that, and even writing a book about it and so on, I wanted to know, had we broken it? Had we kind of done it? Have things changed? And so on. So the research question was simple. Does mental illness stigma exist within the professional services environment? And the way you go about this is quite complicated, and kind of there's a lot more depth to it. So what I kind of, the way I approached it was based off speaking to all these firms, and there was always this disconnect between what leadership said. Oh, we're entirely supportive. We will do everything we can to help our people. Our people are incredibly valuable. Blah, blah, like all this sort of stuff always gets said. And it's always so positive to hear it. I mean, you'll have heard it in your experiences and so on. But then when you speak to the kind of the practitioners, the workers, not the leadership, that there's always this, or there was always this kind of like, okay, yeah, but they just don't get it. They just don't understand. So why would I ever say anything? So I was like, okay, well, there seems to be this break between actual stigma present or present stigma, and then this kind of perceived stigma idea. So I started researching this. I was like, is there a difference? Is there something here? So what I wanted to do in this research was say, does mental illness stigma exist? And so what I needed to do was I needed to compare attitudes towards mental illness to see if that's different to attitudes towards physical illness and attitudes towards no illness. So I had 3 conditions, and I asked people questions about their attitudes and their kind of belief, and then about their perception of others within their organization. I did this towards a kind of vignette of an employee who was displaying kind of anxiety and stress symptoms. And the way it differed is when someone signed up to do the test, they were randomly assigned to a condition that said, this person has confided in you saying that they've had a recent diagnosis of anxiety, or this person has confided in you saying they have a recent diagnosis of diabetes, or there was no line about that. So what I could see is if there was a difference, the only difference that each person experienced outside of their own personal lived experience was this diagnosis of a common mental illness, a common physical illness, or no comment of it. And so this was done, and what was found was that basically there was no difference between any of the conditions, no significant difference. I'll try to use the proper language. So there was no significant difference between them. So that's good. That means that you can say to someone, I've been struggling with my anxiety or my depression or something like that, and attitudes won't change. But what was found was that in all instances, whether it's physical, mental, or no diagnosis, perceived stigma was always worse. So people always believed there was more stigmatic attitudes within the organization than within themselves. And obviously there's some biases that can go on here. People are self-serving, the organization, like people inherently believe other people are worse than themselves and so on, like all this stuff can come into effect. But I always just bring it down to a very simple line where everyone else is the asshole, because that's what is kind of been proven out. And when I was talking to people about this, and I said, well, actually, there's no difference. The first thing everyone always said to me is like, yeah, but of course that's what they're going to say, isn't it? And that in itself reaffirms that perceived stigma is worse than present stigma, and so on. Now, there is another category of stigma that I didn't get to consider, which is called, it's the perspective of the stigmatized. So this is about the individual. So this is experience stigma, anticipate stigma, and internalize stigma, and so on. So that's for another day. But broadly speaking, perceived stigma is much worse than present stigma. And in all cases, the primary component of stigma that is driving these attitudes is affective stigma. So this is to do with emotions and how we feel. And the other components are how we think and how we act, which are kind of stereotyping in how we think, prejudice in how we feel, and discrimination in how we act. But the emotional side was the largest contributor towards the stigmatic attitudes and so on within it. And what's fascinating about this is that much of the work that we have done within industry to lower stigma, and much of the interventions businesses put in place, is best suited to address cognitive stigma, not affective stigma. And this makes sense because we do education, we teach people about things, we put resources in place, but we still ask the individual to do the help seeking and so on. And therefore, there are other approaches that could be more suited within organizations to help them lower affective stigma. And the best way to do this is with contact. And that's meeting, working with, experiencing time with someone who has struggled, is struggling, etc., with their mental health. And that's kind of the long and the short of it, really. Like, I've tried to condense a 5,000 word research paper, like hundreds of hours of my time, into like 5 minutes, but that's kind of the best I can do. Like, let's go through some questions if you have any about them and so on.
Yeah, loads. I think this notion of perceived stigma is worthy of lots of attention. Yes. And I don't think it is recognized. We know about stigma. We've been talking for years about breaking the stigma around mental health. We know that there is stigma. We know in ourselves what stigma we hold towards other people that might be mentally unwell. And that's at all levels of the mental health scale. What are we, what stereotypes have we got in our minds? What judgments do we make? And actually that word judgment is really important here, because the perceived stigma that people might be experiencing, internalizing, as you've mentioned, that I think could be about people judging themselves a lot of the time on what they're thinking, feeling, the way that they're behaving. We're judging ourselves. I'm having a bad day. I've not been sleeping for a week. I'm overworking. I'm struggling with my relationships in life. I haven't been to the gym in a month. I'm judging myself. I'm not feeling good. And I know that things are bad, but I'm holding myself accountable. And I don't feel, and then there's labels that we attach to ourselves with those judgments. That means I'm not a good person, I'm a bad person, I'm a bad employee, I haven't been a good friend, etc., etc. So I think a really hopeful and positive way of being able to reduce that perceived stigma could be about people learning to not judge themselves based on what they're thinking and feeling.
So perceived stigma is tricky because the actual and so the present and the kind of the perspective of the stigmatized and the stigmatizer, it's very easy to say, well, this is stereotyping, this is prejudice, and this is discrimination, the holy trinity of stigma. But perceived stigma it's shared. So there's what's seen and what's experienced. And you can do all the work to reduce all the kind of the Holy Trinity to nil. So there can be none of those attitudes within people or within an organization. But as long as people have internalized some of them, either from their past or their present, through the anticipated and experienced, they will perceive stigma will still exist. So that's why if you want to completely remove these sorts of attitudes, not only do you need to address the kind of the bad attitudes that exist within an organization. So this is things like, go check your employment contracts. Do they have a line that says dismissal for being of unsound mind? That's kind of present stigma that exists. Remove those. Then you also need to do the cultural change to address the perceived stigma that is shared from that aspect. But also the individual needs to let go of their internalized stigma about themselves. So it's actually a much bigger there's more work to be done than just on the kind of face of it. One thing I forgot to mention that is important to state, because I was looking at professional services, I can say that in the majority of cases, on average, in both perceived and present stigma, on average, people disagreed with statements of stigma from themselves and their organization. Now, due to kind of the various, the kind of power analyses and the statistics that go behind it, we can't say this is true of the population because I didn't have enough participants, but it's a very good indication that actually the work that has been done has been successful because on average, people disagree that stigma is present. So that's good. That's really good. And people should kind of take good credit for that. But at the same point, there is so much more work that can be done.
Mm. And if somebody is mentally unwell and feeling vulnerable and fragile, it can be so easy for them to assume that everybody will see that there's something wrong with them. We don't believe that there's something wrong with people that are mentally unwell. It's about creating a network of support opportunities and effective help that will get people to where they want to be. So we've got to be really careful with the way that this is treated. And I think culture, definitely changing the culture has its place, but you've identified there it's the emotional response that people have towards perceived stigma.
Yeah, well, not just perceived, but also present stigma. So it's predominantly an emotional response, an affectional response, where people are kind of, whether it's fear or kind of whether they also get attributed negatively if they're seen as supporting it, like all this sort of stuff. That's what's driving what negative attitudes remain and so on. So that is often like, obviously work needs to be done to look at this in detail, but that's things like, what if this person breaks down in front of me? I'm scared if I have to deal with that and so on. And that's where contact interventions, as they're referred to, where that's kind of like working with people who have a mental illness or something and seeing and experiencing that actually it's not bad. And this is what I say in my presentation. Right now, this is a contact intervention because I live with depression and anxiety. I have experienced suicidal ideation and so on. So you are seeing through this what someone who has lived with these experiences can achieve and so on. And most people would look at this and be like, well, actually, that's what I'd expect anyone could achieve and so on. So suddenly those negative kind of thoughts and so on, and the feelings of fear suddenly they're like, well, actually, you can achieve the same. You're delivering the same, and so on. And so it becomes acceptable, and it becomes a kind of a social, the social construct becomes normalized, and so on.
Yeah. So what would you say is the single thing that businesses could do right now, or set as a kind of short-term goal that would be really helpful? What could they do or do more of?
So the one thing I've always talked about, and I still believe in, it's two things. One of them's a really easy thing, but it's hard to understand, and the other one's really easy to implement, but kind of there's fear attached to it. So the first one is stop calling it mental health. It's just health. Okay, like all of this is just health. And when you start segregating things into mental and physical health, you put barriers between them, and you kind of limit accessibility. Whereas if it's just referred to as health, it's just health. I am ill. I am healthy. Suddenly, the barriers that we have put up around mental health, the stigma that is attached to mental health, it kind of falls away, because suddenly you're just saying, oh, if that's just about health, I'm not gonna fear someone who has broken their arm. So why should I fear someone who has broken their mind? And so on. You get what I mean? So that's
completely.
It's a really simple idea, but it's an incredibly complex one to implement. The thing I think organizations need to do, and this builds off kind of a concept I love called social identity theory, and this is that we as individuals are products of our groups and our social circumstance. And what you should do is anyone within the organization who has struggled, who is willing to, obviously, have them share their experience, have leaders share their experience. What did they do to look after their health? What did they do to promote positive health, and so on? Because if people within a social group, so employees within a firm, if you normalize conversations about health, if you normalize kind of discussing depression, anxiety, things like that, people feel comfortable or knowing that others have shared those experiences, then it becomes a cultural norm. And if it's a cultural norm, the people who are struggling, who are scared from potential stigma or things like that for speaking out, they fear less because it has become accepted within the group already. So have your CEO share their worst time in their life, if they're willing to. Have them talk about the hardest time in their career. Have them talk about what stresses them out. All these sorts of things are important, because if you get those conversations normalized, then much of the fear that prevents people from taking action is removed. And stigma and fear of discrimination or shame or anything like that, that is the single, well, I can't say it's the biggest barrier, because obviously things change, but it's one of the biggest barriers to preventing people from accessing the help that could lead to better life outcomes.
I think both of those suggestions are incredibly powerful, and if they were implemented in businesses, we could see some huge change. Absolutely right. If somebody asks you, how's your mental health? And again, if that person is feeling a little bit vulnerable when they're asked that question, it can be so frightening to even consider how you might answer that openly and honestly and authentically.
Yeah.
But being asked about your health is completely, mental health is up here, and you've talked about the physical and the mental already, and how much more comfortable we are in talking about physical health, but also the differences between thinking, feeling, and acting on something. And mental health focuses on this, but it's so closely linked to our feelings and our behaviors. So we're almost speaking different languages when we imagine we should be when we're talking about mental health.
So here are some fascinating things that there's some of the things I really took away from what I learned over the past year. Our mind and our body are connected. You can't disconnect them. They are 100% part and parcel. You have one body, you have one person, but they're also interconnected with the environment. And this is where it gets really fascinating, because the environment changes a person as well. So if you are in a perpetually stressed environment and suffering from perpetual stress, your body actually enables it for you to become easier to get stressed and things like that. And there are lots of things, like, I won't go into detail, but there's been lots of studies in a field called epigenetics, where our actual kind of genetic makeup changes as we experience the world. And we can't detach ourselves from social circumstances. We can't detach ourselves from other people, and we can't detach our body from our mind. So we need to start looking in a much more holistic view than just the very, well, I want to address mental health and so on. Because to address mental health, you also need to consider the mind as part of the body, and how the body reacts to things that negatively affect mental health, so things like stress, but also how the body and the mind coexist within the environment. Like, so this is why I'm a big proponent of kind of cultural change and things like that as well, because you can do all you want on kind of one individual element, but if you don't change the circumstances within that element exists, then nothing will change overall, because you're always likely to default back to what is present within the environment and so on. And it's why a large part of what I was looking at was stress, and how stress impacts the individual, how it interacts with the body, the mind, etc. And it's why if you can say to people, and I always joke about this as the yoga paradox. You can say to people, oh, do some yoga. Yoga will help de-stress you. Great, it does. It affects the body, which in turn affects the mind. But then if you go back to work the next day and it's the same stressful environment, it doesn't matter that you did yoga the night before or not, you're still back to the same stressful environment and stressed again. And you can rinse, repeat this as many times as you like, do as much yoga as you like. But if you are part of a stressed environment, you will be stressed, and so on. And that is just something that we barely touch the surface on, because cultural change is hard. It is hard. There is no easy cultural change, which is why a lot of what I say is, it gives us an indication, it gives us an idea, but I can't tell you the exact solution that needs to happen. But I can tell you these are things you need to consider to make it kind of positive and so on.
Yeah, that's right. And again, hearing other people, we've mentioned lived experience, we've mentioned leaders sharing their experiences, and what that will do is it will create resonance between one person and another, disregarding seniority, which is really important, but also it's going to help people feel they can trust that support will be effectively available. So it isn't just people at the top saying, we value our employees, we're here to support you, all the stuff that you said about at the beginning. It is more than lip service. This is living and breathing openness and transparency, and actually helping people to feel hopeful about being looked after, knowing that they'll be encouraging people to speak takes more than saying you can talk to me. It's
deeds,
about
not
people,
words.
That's it. Knowing that you will be responded to in a way that feels safe is really important. But yeah, Andy, that's great. Epigenetics, fascinating area of work to look into. And nature and environment, again, I think there's so much that we can use as human beings that can really help. Completely agree with just that idea of health and not isolating physical health. A lot of the time we do offer physical health solutions to people feeling mentally unwell. You've used the example of yoga, and I think that the first thing we learn in yoga is that the mind's got to be still before we can assume any of those yoga positions. I really do want to discuss this issue of stress that you've mentioned, but nature, physical health, and kind of bringing all of that together. We've got lots of seasonal affective disorder happening at the moment. Nature, we can see, if I look out the windows, leaves have been lost from the trees, and the days are obviously a lot shorter. So we could say nature is resting right now as human beings, of these few months, about us doing the same. Can we learn from nature and say, right, we're going to slow down, and all of that energy, all of that activity that we've had through the spring and the summer, is this the time now where we say, right, let's kind of just take our foot off the gas a little bit and allow ourselves, give ourselves permission to do less, so that we're ready to give more when the days are longer and we've got more sunshine and things.
It would be nice to believe that was possible, but one of our social constraints is within our wonderful capitalist society. And we all have jobs, we all work them, we all need to deliver and so on. And that's just one of the constraints we have to be aware of. Like, I'm very conscious that these things exist. And I'm never one to say, well, actually, we need to just fundamentally change society, because that's not possible. Like, cultural change is hard. Societal change is like, that's revolutionary sort of stuff. So it's understanding the confines of what the change you want is, and so on. I always view things in kind of a discrete mathematics sense, where it's like you solve your linear problems to find the boundary cases, and then you find the boundary case that's most optimal for what you want to achieve. So it's just understanding the changes that need to make place are within the confines of what exists, and so on. Like, we can talk about kind of changing the world to like a 4-day working week and things like that. But until that sort of thing is adopted in more places, it's suddenly, because it's still a huge cultural and societal shift to do that. And we can talk about the benefits of kind of reduced stress, blah, 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 benefit to the environment and everything that is incredibly important nowadays. But until more change happens, it will never cascade to become entire societal change and so on.
That's right. And capitalism is a social construct. That's something that we've created outside of the way that nature behaves. Yeah. So you've mentioned stress again there. We've mentioned capitalist societies. I feel that there's a link between those two, because you've been talking a lot about work and working routines and rhythms. And again, you've mentioned stress. You've defined this excessive daily. There's some really shocking statistics that have come out of your research, in that out of the people that you studied, 32% of accountants felt that this is from an official source, isn't it?
Yeah. So, sorry. So what I was saying there was, I believe it's Kelly Fiam from the Chartered Accountants Benevolent Association. This is all written down in my research, so people can go check it. I'm trying to do this from memory, which is challenging. I think it was something like 32% of accountants have experienced stress on a daily basis, or say they feel stress daily. And then I think somewhere close to like 14 or 16%, something like that, have said it's actually forced them to consider kind of changing jobs or things like that. Or no, it's that many percent have forced to take time off as a result of stress. That was it. And then there's another statistic about many of them have said it's forced them to consider changing jobs, and then a certain amount have actually changed jobs as a result. And I think it's around 50% in both cases of experience stress daily and have considered changing jobs because of stress on a daily basis. and things like that. And it's a scary statistic when you hear that and so on. And the reason I'm fascinated in it is because stress is dangerous and things like that. Like, stress is designed as a response to protect the body and to allow it to respond actively to a threat. And people always talk about the 4 Fs: fight, flight, fright, and fuck, or fornicate, or whatever you want to put to it. And that's fine. The idea is something scary happens, your body goes, is it a threat? Yes or no? No? Fine. Yes. Next question. Can I cope with the threat? Yes. No stress. No. Start stressing. Body heightens and then deals with whatever is going on, and then body relaxes and recovers from it. The problem we have is when you heighten, but you never get to recover. And this is the problem with prolonged stress environments at work, because we spend 8 to 10 hours at work and so on. So it could be stress, start recovery, stress, start recovery. And what happens is eventually this response breaks down. And I can't remember who did it. I can find my research at some point, but it's a concept of kind of allostasis and allostatic load, where the body kind of forgets how to recover correctly. And then you get into chronic stress, and it gets really scary, because chronic stress, it's prognostic of mental illness. So it can cause it. It can lead to weakened immune systems. It can lead to recovery of healing. So if you are stressed, having an open wound or a cut heals slower than if you are not stressed. Higher cancer rates, like there's all this sort of stuff that comes from chronic stress. And many people live with chronic stress on a daily basis. So there's some bad stuff that can happen from this. And I'm aware of it because I am an accountant. I have come from that world, and I know the world and the stress that goes with it. And kind of, it's about finding the balance to allow the recovery and so on. And that's one of the things that's so hard within the place of work, is finding the ability to work hard and then take a break, and work hard and then take a break. And why it's so fascinating now is because of COVID, because everyone is now doing this work from their home. So normally what would happen pre-COVID is you would work hard at work in a stressful environment, you would go home and you would relax and you'd recover. But now there's no physical boundary. You're in the same place, working hard, and then there's no physical break. So you find it harder to recover at home, and therefore stress prolongs, stress elongates. You wake up in the same stressful environment that you then work in, are stressed. Then in the evening, you are next to the place, like if you work in a different room or something like that, there is stress perpetuated around you. And that's why it's incredibly important now, in particular, because stress is present in our environment, not only as we're surrounded by a global pandemic and all the kind of scary stuff that goes with that. There's also the experience of stress in our homes and so on. And I find all this fascinating. I absolutely, it terrifies me, but it's fascinating. And there are so many ways we can work better to help people more and allow them to still deliver, but not feel stressed about it and so on. And there's got to be a good way of working that we can get the best of both worlds. There has to be.
There absolutely has to be, because this is real. When you're talking about those physical health conditions that manifest directly from that excessive, unmanaged, long-lasting periods of stress, mental health is no longer an invisible illness. We can see it's got a physical consequence to it, and these sorts of autoimmune diseases.
It's all just health. It's all just health.
It is, yeah. It's all health, and it makes it real. It makes it people can see that this is a an issue. Now, people might feel confident in or comfortable in having that kind of highly pressurized, challenging job. But stress is okay in small doses, isn't it?
Acute stress
helpful.
is good for the body. Acute stress has positive outcomes for the body, but chronic stress doesn't. And there has to be a boundary where you can say, well, this is acute and now you've recovered and it's better. This is chronic and this is bad. So where does that boundary last in our new environment of working 10 hours a day or something like that? Where is that boundary? Like, does that mean we have to feel stressed for 3 hours and then not stressed for 5 hours? Or can we go with being stressed for a week, but then we need half a week off to recover? Like, I don't know, but these are things that that hopefully science can teach us, and so on.
Yeah. I think step one is about people recognizing when they are stressed. And if that stress has become habitual, it's so difficult to know what your triggers are. What is it exactly that's happening at work that's triggering that stress response? Is it there from you starting work? Is it a morning cycle? So recognizing signs, symptoms, how good am I in my relationships, how well am I listening, how mindful am I with the things that I'm doing, how much how good is my performance under stress,
well,
and what else is going on to distract me.
Here's another thing I find fascinating. Most stress results from a lack of resources. Okay, now everything in our world, I kind of see our resources can basically all be kind of proxied down to, kind of simplified down to energy and time. We use money as a proxy for time because you pay people for their time doing something or their experience having done something previously to enable them to do it. And it's about how much energy they resource to do it. So people can spend more energy to do it quicker, or you can have more people spending the same energy to do it, so on. So stress comes from this lack of resources. And in most businesses, you can see this because most people are stressed because there aren't enough people, there aren't enough of the right skilled people, or there isn't enough time, and so on. And what happens is no one confronts those three things. If you are having a problem, if you are stressed and it is prolonged stress, and it is probably due to lack of resource, lack of skill, lack of time, or lack of people. And people are kind of a proxy of time in a way. They're kind of a function of both. Mention it, talk about it, and set, because if you're working a 90-hour week, that could be 2 people working a 45-hour week, or it could be 3 people working 30-hour weeks with a little bit of headroom. Now, the issue is people would rather have one person work that amount of time because if they're on a fixed term contract, then they only pay for the 37 and a half hours a week and so on. So they'd rather have one person pay because they don't pay the extra, yada, yada. Happens. Capitalism rearing its ugly head again. But if you're having a problem that's due to one of these things, then you need to talk about it. Because if you don't talk about it and you don't raise it, nothing's ever going to change. If you feel you need more support in the workplace, then you need to raise it to your manager, to your director, to the partner in charge or the CEO. You need to be saying it, because if they're not hearing you talking about it, then they're never going to do anything about it, and so on. And yes, there are budget constraints, there is cash flow and stuff like that. It may not be possible, but equally, it's unfair that you shoulder the burden of that. And the worst case scenario, if it's too much stress, too much pressure, etc., then they lose you from the business because you don't want to work 90 hours a week, etc.
Yeah.
And then they lose the 5, 10, 15 years of money they'd spent investing in you. So you need to be talking about these things. And yes, it is a tough conversation to have. It is an incredibly hard conversation to have with someone. Say, you know what, this isn't working. But if you don't have the conversation, it's just going to keep happening. And that's kind of the reality of it, and so on. So maybe not necessarily for the people at the top, but for anyone else that's listening, please, if you're having this tough time, speak to it. But equally, if you're a person at the top, if you're a decision maker, ask people, are they resourced correctly? Have they got the right experience to do this? And don't necessarily just trust the kind of the middle management that are running the budget. Ask the people on the ground, are you working the correct amount of time? Because if you're putting in like an insane amount of hours, then do something, help these people. Because ultimately, if people are happier, they are more productive and they will want to do it more. But if people are miserable and people are stressed, then there's eventually a point where they just stop.
Yeah. It's interesting because you've mentioned the cash flow constraints there, but actually there's already a cost to people working whilst they're stressed. The cost of
exactly. Presenteeism.
Exactly that, yeah. So on an individual level, this is about boundaries. You've mentioned people's own boundaries, people actively showing responsibility for their own boundaries, and balance. We've mentioned balance a lot when we're doing work around good mental health and well-being. What is it that you are, where is it that you will get your energy back if you've been expending so much energy to something, might be work, might be
when is your
else.
recovery period?
Exactly.
When do you return to stasis? As in homeostasis, allostasis, whatever stasis you want. When do you return back to not being stressed? And if that's only twice a year when you take a holiday or something like that, then that's probably not good enough.
Yeah. So self-awareness is paramount here because it's about people really looking at their diaries daily, weekly, fortnightly, and how long has your situation been like this, and what is the impact that it's having on you, and what small actions can you take today, right now, to be able to detach and diffuse from that stress that you might have been living in for so long. But at a higher level, this is about resource. It's about our expectations of our people. Have they got what they need to be able to do the work that we expect them to humanly and reasonably within the hours that we've provided them to do it, or contracted them, is the official language, to do this work in. So yeah, definitely some important things that businesses can look at doing there. We've got International Men's Day. People will probably see this on International Men's Day. And you have done a lot in the area of men's mental health. We're now saying men's health. And I know that I've been looking at our statistics actually of how many people have been accessing counselling over the last 18 months. There's been a rise in counselling, people accessing counselling at all levels. So we've spiked across all demographics, apart from with men accessing counselling. So that's interesting to me because everywhere else people are feeling more comfortable, feeling they need counselling, and also feeling that it's an intervention that they will attempt.
Yeah.
So what I want to hear your thoughts on that. What is it that you think could be done to help men be more open about their health?
So this is purely lived experience. I have not studied men's health or men's mental health that much. So my experience here is one of lived. To me, it does come down, I do believe it's linked to stigma. I believe it's linked to kind of fear or shame or something. And like I've actually seen a change in the way me and a lot of my kind of male friends communicate. Like we are a lot more open talking about stuff. There are times in many years gone by where people wouldn't talk about it, but the fact that I know that that some of my friends are on antidepressants, the fact I know they have seen doctors about anxiety and things like that, like that's changed, and that's kind of changed over the past 2 years. I think people are a lot more aware of kind of the mental side of health now. I would want to believe that the reason why people are not coming forward is connected to kind of the fear and shame. There's a lot of old language and societal language that's tied up in men being providers and things like that, and strength. But actually, the world has changed. Men actually don't need to go out, hunt and forage for food anymore and stuff like that. Like our world is so different nowadays. And I feel a lot of it is kind of societal and cultural, and people are kind of like, oh, well, this is what I have to do because I'm a man, and so on. No, you don't have to do anything. You can do what you want, really. I have not experienced much myself, really. Like, as you said at the start of this, I'm very much an open book, so I don't kind of shy away from any of these conversations. But I have chaired a few kind of men's health discussion forums, and people are listening to it, and they are kind of embracing it more. But I think it's more just about, we just need to keep having these conversations. We just need to, like, it comes back to the point where I talked about stigma before and changing kind of social and cultural norms. If men are out there having conversations with other men, being like, like I always joke about this, the kind of like, you okay, hun, sort of thing, where it's like, are you genuinely all right, dude? Because you don't look all right. You look stressed. You look tired. You like, what's up? And so on. If those conversations are happening, then we're halfway there. It's just there might be kind of like where they're happening on a scale large enough to start changing cultural beliefs. Because again, all of this could be internalized and so on. So even though there is no shame or fear that needs to be felt about it, it could all be internalized, and therefore it's hard to kind of undo without personal interventions and so on. So it's a challenging one. I do wish we would stop talking about, like, as I said, stop talking about mental health and physical health, just talk about health. Like, whilst yes, the biology of men and women is different, we're all humans. We are all one species. And one of my long-standing beliefs is, if we thought more as a species and less as countries or individuals, we would be a much better society for all. Because you stop worrying about sort of capitalism and the future of your own personal beliefs and benefits, and start thinking about, well, I would like humanity to live another 100 years. How can I do that when the planet is going to be uninhabitable in 50? You know what I mean? Like, if you start thinking as a species, suddenly you start thinking a lot more kind of grandiose and getting people together. But again, this is kind of huge revolutionary stuff. It's not easy, but I just wish we would start thinking on those sorts of scales, because suddenly all the things that many people worry about, so climate, ecosystems, education, all of this, it pales in comparison when you start thinking about, well, does humanity live into the 23rd century? Or those sorts of things. Like, does it? I don't know the science, so I can't tell you. But I think if we start thinking a bit more like that, there's a much more positive spin on everything we do.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear. Well, if we look at health, mental, physical, emotional, whatever we want, the type of health we're looking at and calling it health, if we can see on that picture of all the different types of health, of all the different types of people, and there's one or two or three people that share a demographic that are not accessing mental health services, that could either say that's great because those people are all mentally healthy and doing great, or it could say there's
something
issue.
preventing them.
But I completely understand the need to highlight and and make health services more accessible and to promote them in that particular area. However, I know in your presentation and today you've mentioned bringing lots of things together. Actually, Andy, your very first presentation was you standing in front of audiences and sharing your experience, knowing that other people in that audience would be able to resonate. And there were lots of people that stayed behind after those presentations and said to you, I understand what you're talking about because it's my life. And that was huge. That was so hard hitting. And you're saying that something that made it easier to do this research during the pandemic was knowing that other people were going through the same thing as you. And it made it so much easier to give to people during that time because we could see that everybody was going through some struggle at some level because of what was happening in the globe. So that human aspect and focusing on that, I understand how that could help us move forward together with unity towards tackling these issues of health and mental health. I've had a quick scan of our pre-prepared interview questions. We haven't gone through them. We didn't get past the first one, but in a roundabout way, somehow we have actually answered all of them despite not even looking at them.
I've got them up on my screen here, so I'm making sure I answer them, regardless of what your questions say.
The art of remote working. I didn't even look at the questions. I was just going off what you're saying, but the art of remote working, you've got.
It's all right. I was guiding us through it.
Good, brilliant, fab. That's great. Well, it's been an insightful, lively, engaging conversation. There's clearly so much that we can take from the insights that you've given us. We will continue to talk to each other and make more great things happen and help people to become more healthy as we do that. So thank you so much, Andy, once again.
Thank you. It's always nice to have a good conversation.
Absolutely. Look after you, and we will see each other again soon.
Yep, speak soon. Now. Take care.
Thanks, Andy. Bye for now.
Bye.